I'm here today for our first Tuesday talk. Every Tuesday we're going to be coming to you with a different conversation about all things real estate. We're going to hit on topics of debate, we're going to hit on real estate etiquette, we're going to talk about shift in the market, a bunch of exciting things to come. I will have guests in the coming weeks, but for today we decided to start off with something that was just with me. We interviewed all the brokers and we asked them what was important to them right now. A lot of people seem to still have questions about the time off market fee, the T.O.M fee. So that's what I'm going to be talking to you about today. So this came out last year, at the end of last year. Most of our brokers have heard about this. We did have a free business planning event in November, and we brought in Ashley Strauss-Martin. She did a 2-hour presentation that included this, answered questions for you guys. And then Scott Dean, our qualifying broker, did 3 classes after that on the T.O.M fee. So hopefully you all know everything that I'm going to tell you about today, or you might get a couple ideas or things in there. So I've interviewed a lot of brokers inside our office and outside of our office. I've talked to Gar, I've talked to our broker Scott Dean and Ashley Strauss-Martin about different things that have come up. I've talked to an appraiser and a lender. So I have a lot of information today, so let's get started. The first things that we're going to be talking about is, of course, the page 1 of the purchase agreement, where it talks about the T.O.M fee. There's going to be deadlines in there that you can put in there. You can put in the amount that you're going to have for that. So once you put that in there, that's a negotiation tactic between the seller and the buyer. That has nothing to do with the broker. We're not deciding whether or not T.O.M fees are used. That's something that Scott would really like me to emphasize. This is not the broker's decision. This is the buyer or the seller's decision whether or not it's going to be used. There are information sheets that we're going to talk about later on that will give you all the information on that. But we are going to go over all the facts that I've been able to come up with, the pros and cons, the forms that you will be using in those form numbers so you have easy access to them, and then delivery. I'm also going to give you some examples of things that I've heard that have happened and how those situations were handled. All right, so let's jump into the facts. Number 1, a question we get a lot, is the T.O.M fee required? No, it is completely optional. The buyer does not have to make an offer with the T.O.M fee, and then it's optional for the seller if they want to counter back with the T.O.M fee included. It's really important that you are going over that information sheet with your buyers and sellers so they understand those pros and cons of why or why not they would want to include that in the transaction. So next, is the T.O.M fee credited towards purchase price or closing costs? We get this question a lot. The answer is no. This is a direct fee that goes to the buyer, or to the seller from the buyer. It does not go to the title company. It is not handled like earnest money. It goes directly to the seller. They cash that and they can go spend it on whatever they want. New pair of shoes, dinner, their gas bill. It's up to them. That money does not go back to the buyer. And I'll talk about an example here in a little bit about where there was some confusion on that on one of the deals. The suggested amount by Ashley Strauss-Martin is $50 to $500. So depending on the size of the house, that's how you're going to decide how much the buyer's going to offer to do, $50 to $500, and the same for the seller if they wanted to counter back on that. I'll give you some examples as well moving forward on that in just a minute. So I already kind of hit on the earnest money. It does not work like earnest money. It is never going to go to the title company. It's delivered and handled completely different. So think about that. And then earnest money, kind of the rationale behind all of why the T.O.M fee was created in the first place. I talked to Gar and the Professional Standards Committee, and they couldn't give me an exact statistic, but they told me about 90% of the calls that they get to the Professional Standards Committee are about earnest money dispute. They're having so many problems with that they decided they needed to come up with hopefully a solution for that, and that was the T.O.M fee that they created. So let's go into that. Let's go into the pros and cons of the T.O.M fee. So why was there so many earnest money disputes? Realistically, because brokers are not doing an adequate job explaining to their clients, the buyer and the seller, what the pros and cons are of using a T.O.M fee or what the pros and cons are of having earnest money. Okay, so let's talk about earnest money a little bit and the whole reason why we started to use the T.O.M fee or why they created the T.O.M fee. So they were finding that the majority of the time, brokers are not adequately explaining earnest money. They're not adequately explaining to buyers how they can get their earnest money back, and they're not adequately explaining to sellers how those sellers are going to get earnest money or not get earnest money. So typically, if a buyer defaults for no reason and pulls out of the contract, a seller should get the earnest money back, right? Right. If, on the other hand, if the buyer backs out for inspections, for appraisal, for a finance contingency, then the buyer should get the earnest money back. Well, when it's not adequately explained to a buyer or to a seller, there becomes conflict at the end and everyone's fighting over this money. There's a long process involved if we do that. One of those is ombudsman, that you guys would go to ombudsman first, have a conversation, try and see if you can figure it out. If that doesn't work, you would go to mediation. If mediation doesn't work out, the third option would be litigation. Of course, we want to try and work together and resolve things before litigation, but that does happen. People do go to litigation when earnest money is a really high amount and both parties think that they deserve it. So T.O.M fee was created basically because the sellers were never getting any money because most buyers are backing out due to inspections. But there was this conflict because things weren't explained properly. So they put this in place so that the seller hopefully gets at least some bit of money for taking their property off the market during that due diligence period for buyers to do their inspections. So as you can see, the pros and cons that I have put up here are pretty much the exact opposite for the buyer and seller. So if you read those, the pros for the buyers are typically the cons for the sellers and vice versa. But in the long run, what they're trying to accomplish is that one, there's a small amount of money that's going to be put up, and the buyer has the confidence that the property is going to be off the market, and the seller has the confidence that they're going to get something for taking their house off the market. So think about that when you're talking to the buyers and the sellers and you are explaining what the pros and cons are for using the T.O.M fee. Okay, so the next thing that we want to talk about is these forms. The best form you could possibly use is Form 2104A. This is the information sheet about the T.O.M fee and earnest money. I basically just kind of gave you the gist of what this form goes over, but just read it. Take 5 minutes, read the form, get familiar with it, practice talking about it. You should be talking about this with every buyer and seller and going over this form with them so they understand. This is a new thing in our marketplace and most people are not going to know what we're talking about when you ask about a T.O.M fee. So make sure you include this, make sure you talk to them about it. The second form is 2104B, and that is the receipt for the T.O.M fee. So I will talk about that with delivery, and that's on the next slide. So we're going to move on to delivery. So there's 3 ways that the T.O.M fee can be delivered. Number 1, the buyer can give the T.O.M fee to their broker, and then that broker can turn around and give it to the listing broker. Number 2, the buyer can deliver it directly to the listing broker or their brokerage. Or number 3, they can deliver it directly to the seller via mail or electronic. Electronic, we've had conversations about that. Venmo, PayPal, however you're going to send it to them, but we do want a record of it. So Form 2104B is where you would get confirmation from all the parties on how that is delivered. Remember that there is a delivery deadline. So if the buyer is opting to mail that to a seller, especially if they're out of town, you might want to consider doing FedEx or something that is guaranteed delivery time so that you know that you're hitting those deadlines and it's being properly delivered to them. So besides all of that, I want to give you guys a few examples of things that I've come across. So a couple brokers in our office have used this T.O.M fee. One of them was a $410,000 purchase. The T.O.M fee on that was $250. So a $250 T.O.M fee. Delivery of that one happened from broker to broker. So the buyer delivered it to their broker, that broker delivered it to the listing broker, and then they gave it to the seller. So a few different hands touched it on that one. A second example was a $470,000 house. That was a $250 T.O.M fee as well. That one was mailed directly to the seller from the buyer, and then they received signatures on Form 2104B after they knew that the seller had received it in the mail. So, as a side note, I want all our brokers to know that you will be required to have 2104B in your file if you do have a T.O.M fee on your contract. So make sure that you're using that and tracking that down before you close, so you're not running after people after closing to get that. The last example that I wanted to give was an example that we talked about, appropriate amounts of T.O.M fee, $50 to $500 is what Ashley Smartin is suggesting. We did have one broker, that received a $5,000 T.O.M fee on the purchase agreement. But then there was an addendum at the back that said that the T.O.M fee was going to go towards the buyer's closing costs. Now, when our broker tried to explain that that's not how T.O.M works, there was a little bit of a dispute, and that broker said that their QB told them all T.O.M money goes towards closing costs. So remember, that is incorrect. T.O.M fee does not go towards closing costs. It does not go towards purchase price. It is directly to the seller. It's not a credit. It's not refundable. They get to keep it. So keep that in mind when you're making offers or counter offers. Make sure that the buyer and the seller fully understand what is going on. And if you have any questions, feel free to please reach out to us. Reach out to me or reach out to Scott. We're always available to try and answer your questions. You're also going to be able to leave any comments below on our YouTube page. So feel free to comment, and we'll try and answer any questions that you have. I also wanted to touch on the fact of what the lenders and appraisers are saying. So I talked to a lender today in depth, and he does quite a bit of business. He told me that he has only maybe seen one purchase where a T.O.M fee was included on there. Besides that, he hasn't seen anything come through. The same with an appraiser that I spoke with. He's doing 30 plus deals a month. He's only seen maybe one a month that's coming through. And all the buyers or all the brokers out there that I talked to and interviewed, I had a hard time finding people that have actually had an experience with this. So I don't think this is being used that much in the marketplace yet. I don't think it has been embraced, but I think that, like everything, it will take a little bit of time. So this is something that we'll probably touch base on in the future. Maybe in 6 months we'll touch back, have some new information or some new insight. Maybe we'll even have some changes to the wording or the way that things are being handled. So I'll touch base on that in the future. So please join me next week. We are going to be talking about Shift Happens. That's next week, February 5th. We're going to be talking about the shift in the marketplace. Not just a shift from a seller's market to a buyer's market, but also a shift in technology and how that's going to affect our industry overall. I am going to have some guest speakers, and we are going to have an announcement of something that we're bringing to the Albuquerque marketplace. So check in with us next week. I look forward to talking to you.